Hey friends, it's Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground. Welcome to this episode of The Underground, a program that explores the testimony of the biblical prophets, the gospel of Jesus Christ, current events, and how all of these things relate to you and me. Now, on this episode, we're doing something a little bit different. Earlier in the year, just at sort of the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, I took some time to talk about the issues of vaccines and the mark of the beast. And probably not too surprisingly, in a lot of ways, the video did go fairly viral, or it's probably my most watched video. There's no question that we're living in interesting times. I think one of the greatest challenges for Christians these days is, well, really for anyone, is the ability to accurately assess the reliability of information. I mean, we are flooded with information, not just with opinions, but with news and authoritative statements, oftentimes which are conflicting. And so it's really difficult to know and to discern what is truth. You think with the information revolution, we would really be able to know what truth is, but the fact is it's actually becoming much more difficult. And so we have a guest with us in this episode, and this is a bit different. Our guest is a specialist in the medical field, really specifically in the arena that we're talking about. So we're going to take some time just to talk about the issue of vaccines. We're going to talk specifically about the COVID-19 vaccines that are just coming out. We're just going to talk about some of the health issues, the ethical issues, the safety issues, and these type of things, and just allow everyone. I know there's going to be a lot of opinions. Anytime you discuss these issues, there's going to be tremendous opinions. But just to have a conversation and put it out there and let the church pray through these things and work through them themselves. So with that said, my guest, for what it's worth, we're actually going to blur out his face and we're going to use a different name. Why are we doing that? Because we live in cancel culture. People... they're concerned about sort of putting themselves out there. Any video can go viral. People lose their jobs over sharing simple likes on social media and this type of thing. But just to protect our guest, we're actually going to protect his identity. But let me just begin by saying, John, thank you so much for joining us. And I want to just begin by asking you just to share your credentials. I think it's important that people know who you are, your background, your expertise, and this type of thing. So why don't you go ahead and just introduce yourself to everyone?
Sure. So thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. I hope we can have a great conversation today and hopefully delve into some of these topics here. So some of my credentials are I have a PhD in Molecular Genetics and Genomics with a focus on molecular microbiology. I have about 10 years of research in mainly bacterial virulence factors that are vaccine candidates. And in addition to that, I have 20 peer-reviewed published papers, as well as time in industry that develops these rapid DNA-based diagnostics. And most recently, I work at a company that produces pharmaceuticals and vaccine components.
So you're not just a YouTuber with some opinions. You've actually got some really legitimate credentials. So let me just begin. I'm just going to ask you a real broad question just to begin. A lot of Christians today, not just Christians, but in the Christian world in particular, you have a lot of Christians that are just virulently anti-vaccine, anti-vaxxers. And then you have others that are a bit more cautious, they're a bit more selective, and then you have others that are just fine. They don't even really question vaccines, they just get them all, really don't do any research. But you've got quite a gamut. Obviously, you're in this field. You've been in this field for quite a long time. What's your general stance when it comes to vaccines?
Well, from my perspective, vaccines have been one of the best medical advances basically ever. Without them, we'd still be dealing with diseases like smallpox, polio, and any number of diseases that kill millions, if not hundreds of millions of people throughout history. We don't think of those now because the vaccines worked and we eradicated those diseases. So those in general have helped humanity tremendously. As far as if you wanted to talk about safety of vaccines or any concerns about those, I would like to assure people that vaccines in general are very safe and they don't contain dangerous drugs or anything that is really unnatural. It's just a way of making your body adapt to these pathogens, viruses, bacteria, to be able to fight them if ever encountered.
So let me just add something too, because I think this is important in terms of your credentials. Not only are you a specialist in this field, but you're also a believer. In fact, my connection to you came through some mutual friends. You're actually part of their church and their home church and this type of thing. So that's probably important to take note of. With my last video, really my video was simply this. I said, look, there may be a lot of legitimate reasons for people to be concerned about vaccines and this type of thing. There's a lot of issues to be concerned with in terms of government overreach. When we start talking about mandating vaccines, all of this, I said, but it's not the mark of the beast. And that was really the essence of what I was trying to say is, biblically speaking, there's all this talk that vaccines are the mark of the beast. And I said, vaccines are not the mark of the beast. And for that, I was called a shill. You must work for Bill Gates. Your father is the devil. I pretty much wake up with a dozen comments and messages almost every day for the past several months, accusing me of all kinds of things. So it's important just to qualify that John is a believer. He's a brother. He does not work for Bill Gates. He doesn't, serve the devil and this type of thing. So let me just touch on a few of the things that you just said. Vaccines, you said, don't contain, anything detrimental to the body, anything unhealthy. Obviously, you'll hear a lot of people talk about them having mercury and I didn't put this in the questions, but just in terms of sort of piggybacking off what you just said, people will talk about them being the cause of all sorts of, problems with kids, particularly Asperger's syndrome or any of these, autism and so forth. You've also got a lot of stuff out there that will say, well, you've got different vaccines that essentially went bad, particularly in Africa and India, and did cause widespread damage and death and this type of thing. So just touch on that. I know I didn't put that in the questions, but just touch on that because I know inevitably that will come up. I hear these sort of things repeated online all the time. So I wanted just to give you a chance to touch on those.
Sure. So there's a lot in the questions you just asked.
Sure. And
I can try to break out some of the ones. Obviously, probably the biggest one that people always hear and are concerned about is do vaccines cause autism? So that came about in the late 80s, early 90s, where a group of scientists looked at a population and found that the people who in that population who received vaccines had a higher rate of autism, is basically what the study found. So it was picked up on by the media and basically they ran with it. After several years later, all but one of the authors on that paper had come to the conclusion that the study was flawed. And actually, they all retracted their names from that paper. So not only has the scientific community rejected that, the people who were on the paper rejected that, except for one individual who then went on to make it his campaign and his mission to spread these rumors without scientific basis. And since then, he has been ostracized from the medical community. His medical license has been revoked, and he has essentially no scientific credibility. In general, there has been very little to no evidence to suggest that vaccines directly cause autism. As far as good quality scientific research with the proper controls has been conducted. So there's one part of your question. Another one was about the like mercury and things being in vaccines, and that comes from a compound called thimerosal that was used again about the same time, 80s, 90s, and they were arguing that that was the trigger for the autism. And again, studies were conducted and no conclusive proof was ever shown that it did or didn't cause autism, just because the power of the studies couldn't really prove that. Since then, as a concern, the pharmaceutical industry has removed that from all vaccines, so that is no longer in vaccines. And in general, a general principle of vaccines is not to introduce something unnatural to the body. It's to introduce a part of the disease that you're trying to prevent, and then have the body make its own defense to this disease. So it's not a chemical that hangs around your body. It's usually a part of the pathogen, and then your immune system reacts to it and causes a memory response in your immune system, so that if it ever sees it again, it can fight it off.
Good. And then in terms of just the issue of bad vaccines or problems throughout Africa and India, I think it really affects, I'll see a lot of comments come in from African countries and this type of thing, and they say, well, you don't know what Bill Gates did in Africa or this type of thing. And I see those type of things stated quite a lot.
I can't speak as much to studies done overseas, but as far as the U.S. approach to approving any vaccines or any new drugs in general, it goes in three different phases. And the first stage is a very small safety trial. And this is generally very healthy people who are a very narrow age range, so just generally healthy people. The second stage is a much larger group that includes maybe not your perfect health individuals. And these are usually very large, very long studies to prove the safety of the vaccine before you even get into anything with how effective it is at preventing the disease that it's designed to treat or prevent. So as far as the U.S. market, there is an extremely long and arduous process generally to get a vaccine to market. It has to go through a lot of safety trials. I would imagine overseas there's more of the, I wouldn't say rush, but sometimes the need outweighs some of the risks when certain diseases would be endemic or pandemic through a population that has a very high mortality rate. They may try experimental vaccines and things that have not been thoroughly vetted as much. But for those overseas trials, I'm not an expert in those.
Okay, so I want to touch on one other issue that I hear brought up quite a lot, which is people will say, they'll make comments, they'll say vaccines have aborted baby tissue in them. That was a statement that I actually got just this morning. No thanks, I'm not going to inject myself with aborted baby tissue and this type of thing. And my understanding, and you can tell me if I'm right, is that essentially some vaccines, not all vaccines, but there are some that do have cells which have been cultured from two babies that were aborted back in the 60s. And from some of the cells from those babies, again, they have these cell lines that have been cultured now for, 50, 60 years. Talk about that a little bit, because obviously, there obviously is a technical difference between cells that have been cultured versus, aborted baby tissue. That's obviously a bit more dramatic. But nevertheless, for Christians, there are some ethical issues here. And again, if I understand it right, not all vaccines, but there are some vaccines that do have this and others that don't. So touch on that, because I think that's important for Christians.
There are currently 3 vaccines that are grown in human tissues that you described. So these are the chickenpox vaccine, rubella, and hepatitis A. And they are grown in the human fibroblast cells that originated from 2 aborted embryos in the 1960s. So essentially, these are skin cells. And the reason they are still used is that these viruses have to grow in human cells in order to survive. So they grow in these cells, and then these cells have a particular component of the cell line, and that they will grow until they can't anymore and basically die, which is desirable in a cell line, so that we can continually use these cells and always have similar cells available, as well as we know that the virus will grow in these cells to make the components of this, or to make the virus that is then purified and chopped up to make the vaccine. So yes, there are 3 vaccines that use these. These skin cells can no longer become humans. They are skin cells. They are not embryonic. They're not embryos or anything that could grow into babies. So it's not like we're killing babies continuously, but those cells were originally derived from human embryos. Yes.
And what does this look like? I mean, how do you culture a cell? So you begin with a cell back in the mid-1960s sometime. How do you then replicate cells from that original cell? I mean, just explain that a little bit to me.
Okay. So these cells were originally isolated. Basically, they were teased apart with a microscope or any other variety of techniques that used to separate cells based on their type and things like that. And now they're grown in petri dishes with just media, and they'll stick to the bottom. You put media, certain growth chemicals on top. It's not really chemicals. It's like sugars and proteins and basically calorie-containing things that allow these cells to grow, and they will grow in these little plates, and they'll grow until they fill the plate. And after a certain number of passages, they'll basically die, and you can start over. That's the beauty of using these type of cells, is that you can start them fresh and they're still the same thing. And they're a very strong scientific tool, not just these cell lines, but there's many cell lines used for similar purposes derived from a variety of different tissue types, animal types, that aren't from these aborted embryos or anything like that. It's just these specific ones are necessary for these specific viruses.
So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because we're going to get into the COVID vaccines. We've got 2 that are being talked about right now. Pfizer and Moderna have 2 that they're offering. There may be more to come. Do either of these 2 utilize the embryonic cultured cells?
No, they do not. They are RNA-based vaccines, which is a new class of vaccine, and we can talk about that further. But they do not use human cells for any part of their production.
I don't want to get too much into COVID itself, because that really, it's a whole can of worms, and it's a whole other issue. Obviously, within the body of Christ, there are still those that probably think the whole thing is just a hoax. It doesn't exist. Let me just say, for brevity, I do believe that COVID is real. My sister had it. I had a friend that died. He was only 52 or 54 that died. I've had a handful of friends that had it, and they say it was really not a big deal. But I do believe it exists. I have friends, that work in hospitals, and they go, yeah, people are dying. They're coming in. They all have the same symptoms. COVID is real. That said, I would fall into the category of thinking that a lot of world governments are using it. Unfortunately, I think in some cases they're exaggerating the threat and the danger. I don't personally believe in the lockdown. I don't want to get into all that, but I do think there's a lot of dangers in terms of personal freedoms, government overreach, and on and on and on. Some of the stuff we're seeing in England, in Australia right now, some of the sort of horror stories, I'm going, and even just some of the things that they're talking about in terms of mandatory vaccines and needing some type of digital ID in order to travel, all of these things. These are big issues to talk about, but I don't want to take too much time to get into that. I did want to just say that I do believe COVID is real. I do believe that those that are vulnerable, that do have comorbidities, that are obese or have diabetes or this, that, or the other thing, African Americans have about a 2.5 times higher chance of actually dying from it. There's different populations and so forth. So that's where I stand. Again, I know I'll get all kinds of flack simply for saying that, but I did want to just get that out of the way and move on. I want to jump into, before we actually talk about the vaccines, I want to talk about some of the testing that's taking place, because this kind of does tie into what I was just saying. Right now, if I understand it correctly, you have the primary tests that are being used are the PCR tests. And I think they're about to, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, they're about to roll out the rapid tests, which are not the PCR tests, it's a different form of test, which could potentially be a bit more accurate. But explain the PCR test, and then just talk about why you're hearing all kinds of different stories. We saw, what's his name? The CEO of Tesla, he tweeted a week or so ago, something is really wrong, something's crazy, I got a bunch of tests, 2 came back negative, 2 came back positive. And, this type of things, a lot of people talking about false positives. So just explain the PCR tests, and then I'll probably jump in with another question.
Okay, sure. So I have a lot of background in this, in that I designed FDA-cleared tests for detecting a lot of different bacterial infections and things using PCR technology. So PCR technology uses little bits of DNA to basically target other bits of DNA, and then to amplify it and to make a lot of it. So you can start with a very small amount of DNA in a person, in a solution, on your desktop, however, where it is. And you can use this technology to then make a lot of it. And then there are mechanisms by which you can then detect that lot of DNA, either fluorescently or by color or by mass. There's a lot of different ways you can do it. So what they're doing with the COVID test is they're using that long, obnoxious Q-tip to get into your nose and to see if then they can swab out any COVID, in this case RNA. And they'll take that swab, and then they'll run one of these tests on it, these PCR tests. And based on if from that test they can those small pieces of DNA, then they'll say you have COVID DNA or RNA, in this case, in your nose, therefore you get a positive test.
Let me ask you, tell me again, I've listened to different podcasts and heard different clips from Dr. Fauci and so forth. So if I understand it right, the PCR test, they essentially cycle through so many times. They cycle through the DNA, or as you said, amplify the DNA to where, let's say, they run the test, and let's just say within the first or second cycle, they immediately detect COVID. Well, if it only takes 1 or 2 cycles, it's really clear. You clearly have a pretty high viral load. You're infected. In other cases, they might have to cycle through 20, 25 times before they finally detect a little bit, in which case you may be infected, but it's a very minimal amount. Now, what I heard Dr. Fauci say is anything above 25 cycles is essentially irrelevant. I mean, if you cycle through enough, you could probably just take a sample of air randomly anywhere in the world. Eventually, you're going to find a tiny bit, if you just keep going. But some of the PCR tests right now they're running are up to like 35 cycles, which will then give people a positive. Whereas It could be that they were exposed 3 months ago, or, there's just such a small amount. They're not infected. They're not contagious or anything like that. So do I understand that right? There's a certain number of cycles that they're using, which is probably a little higher than what they should be using, which is probably, I don't say exaggerating, but it's amplifying the positive results.
I think you have a very accurate idea of what the tests are and how they work. Yes. So if you use the PCR technology and you detect that you get a positive hit back in a low number of cycles, then that is a very high indicator that that person has a lot of COVID virus in that sample. So if the test then proceeds and goes through 25, 30 cycles, like you're saying, then it comes back positive, it's likely that there is still some COVID RNA in the person. It's just a very low amount. So most likely don't have an active infection. They could be transiently colonized, but you're not having like full-blown symptoms in that case. Because if you're actively sick, you're shedding millions, billions of virus in your cough, when you sneeze and things like that. I mean, the numbers are astronomical. And those are the things that those tests are very good at detecting. They're not so good, not so accurate when it's very small amounts. I mean, like you were saying, it's unlikely that if you took a sample of air and just cycled it, you would get a target, but you can get off-target effects. And that if something is kind of similar, it doesn't amplify well, it's not efficiently made, like the target is, then yes, you can get false positives from that. Say, for example, this isn't the case, but say, for example, you had a normal cold virus, and it shared some similarity to COVID, then eventually, after a certain number of cycles, it could show up as a false positive. Now, I'm not saying that the cold is going to show up as a COVID positive, but just something example like that. Anything that it's potentially you could have a small cross reactivity that would then show up at these high number of cycles and 30, 35 cycles of amplification.
And then is there another test that's coming out soon that might be a little bit more accurate? Do I understand that the rapid tests, is that different than the PCR test?
So to my knowledge right now, there's two different types of tests. There's antibody-based tests and your DNA-based tests. So the DNA-based tests are testing for what is in that sample at that moment. So it's not testing if you had COVID 3 years ago or 3 months ago or 3 days ago. It's what's in that sample right then. With antibody-based tests, they would take a sample and look for the presence of COVID antibodies or antibodies from you that specifically recognize COVID. So there's a couple caveats here in that it would then show that you have had the infection at some point in time. It could have been several months ago, or it could be, like I said, a week ago, and you could have an active infection. But then that also assumes that you're producing antibodies to the virus at that stage. So if you come in, you are very early in the infection, the antibodies might not have been produced yet by your immune system, and that could come back as a negative. Gotcha. So there's some strength to it. It would show you if you've had it in the past, but it may not be as accurate for do you have it now. So that's a little bit of the difference between an antibody test and a nucleic acid DNA RNA-based test.
Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into the actual COVID vaccine. So we've got two that have been announced, not surprisingly, about 2 days after the elections. I think Pfizer announced theirs, and very shortly thereafter Moderna announced theirs. They're both claiming about 95% effectiveness. What are the differences between these two?
Okay, so they're very similar in that they're both RNA-based vaccines. And what they've done is manufactured the RNA for the spike protein of COVID. So this is one of the little attachment factors. You're probably familiar with the diagrams. You see the ball with all the little spikes coming off of it. Yeah. It's RNA that encodes for those spike proteins. So Uh, both of them are very similar. They're a little different in how they're constructed, but they have a very similar target, and that they're using RNA that would be used to produce these spike proteins of the virus.
So I'm fascinated by all this stuff because I'm not a scientist and I have a hard time. I'm fascinated, obviously, just by the human body or just biology in general. But let me try to explain it the way I imagine it, based on what I've heard, and maybe it'll be helpful. So essentially, we see all these pictures of the COVID cells. It's essentially a ball that has these little suction cup spiked barbs kind of all over it. So now this is the virus. It enters your body, and when it rubs up against or comes into contact with other cells that are more vulnerable, these barbs essentially latch onto and penetrate other cells, and then it injects the viral load into these other cells, thus infecting them. Is that basically how it starts?
Yes, it's a pretty accurate description. So you have those barbs or spikes on the outside, and what the virus will do is it just floats along until it finds a cell that has a protein sticking out of it that attaches to those spikes or barbs. And then it triggers that cell then takes in the virus, actually.
Takes it in.
And then once inside, the virus basically injects its RNA into the host cell, and that then instructs the cell to basically make millions of viruses. It now just becomes a factory for viruses, and that's all it does.
Okay, so then your body starts actually manufacturing it. So then essentially these RNA vaccines, and this is really something new, so they're creating a protein that looks like the COVID cell. It looks like these barbed cells, but yet they're empty, so to speak. They don't have the virus. So your body gets flooded with these cells that are shaped like or similar to the COVID virus, and then your body kind of just gets annoyed with them and says, hey, these things are everywhere, they're annoying, and it develops its own form of resistance to this. So that if you do actually get a COVID cell, your body's prepared, it's adapted, it's adjusted to where it's now somehow built up defenses. Is that right?
Yeah, I think you got the gist of it. So this RNA vaccine, it's basically a little ball of RNA that is going to be injected into individuals. That ball of RNA is formulated in such a way that it can attach to cells and then inject the RNA into them. So there's no COVID proteins at all involved in this vaccine approach. The RNA that they're injecting encodes for part or all of that spike protein, or the little grappling hook protein that you see. So then it takes, and your cells will then produce that protein. So not ad nauseum, it's not like they're having the viral infection, but they will produce this spike protein.
Gotcha.
Your immune system then recognizes this and say, hey, that's not normal. That's not part of me. Because of that, it then starts to make an immune response against that protein, in which case you get some specialized immune cells as well as antibodies produced eventually, where you've never had the vaccine. All you got was your cells making this protein that's not of them. They recognize it as foreign and make a response against it.
Technically, would you essentially be immune just to the common cold? Is that a possible side effect?
No. So these proteins are very specific to every virus. Every virus has its own. They all have their own different sequences and structures. So, cross-reactivity is possible, but an immunity to another virus or bacteria is highly unlikely.
Obviously, this has been rushed, and that's a good thing. It's positive that we got them out so quickly. That's, I think, the success of capitalism. You know, President Trump put out some pretty significant incentives to the pharmaceuticals to get these created. Obviously, there's a lot of competition in this type of thing. But with them being rushed out, obviously, there hasn't been nearly as much time for testing, especially long-term testing for side effects and this type of thing. What are the possible potential side effects that we could see? Negative inflammatory responses and just different things like that. Like, obviously, they're talking about some side effects. They say you feel really crummy for a week or so, and then you have to get it injected again. But just with your background and your expertise, what potential side effects could you foresee?
So vaccines are meant to cause an immune response in your body. That is the whole purpose of a vaccine. And what you see when you get a viral infection, when you cough, when you sneeze, when you get a fever, that's your immune response responding to the virus. So the virus doesn't give you, a runny nose or a cough. That's generally your body responding to try to get rid of the virus. So if you have a vaccine and you have no symptoms whatsoever, you probably don't get a good immune response to that virus or to that vaccine, which means that you may not have a great immune response and you may not be as protected. So like when you go and you get a flu vaccine every year, or if you do get a flu vaccine, your arm's usually sore for a while afterwards. That's good, because then that means that your immune system is going to where you got that vaccine and making an immune response to it. So in this case, from the studies I've seen so far, there are side effects to this vaccine, just like basically any other vaccine, and that you're going to get a soreness in the injection site. It may turn red. You may have some pain in that joint or wherever you get it injected. And then you're right, there have been some cases of fever, which is, again, it means that your body is recognizing that you have gotten something different that's not itself, and it's making an immune response to it. From what I've seen, there haven't been many cases of severe reactions. Most of them are mild symptoms. You kind of feel crummy for a day. You may have like some cold or flu-like symptoms for a day or three or something like that, but it's nothing that it's nothing severe. If it was, the FDA would be flagging these, and they would not have gotten nearly as far as they have so far.
Right. I mean, obviously, there haven't been anything too alarming in the short time that we've had, but is there any potential long-term side effects that could emerge? Let's say in 2 years, where we see a certain percentage, maybe 10%, end up having, some type of autoimmune related. Something like this. It seems like there's always those type of potential long-term side effects.
Right. So there's no danger of the vaccine sticking around. RNA by its very nature is highly unstable, and it's designed that way so that your cells don't become full of RNA and explode basically every minute of your day. So the vaccine itself will not stick around. It'll be gone in a matter of days, hours to days, actually. And then it's just the remnant protein that your body is producing. As far as cross-reactivity down the road, it's difficult to say. It is unlikely, but I won't say it's not possible, because certain diseases do that. Like, for example, there's a disease that if you have a strep throat, then potentially later you can develop an autoimmune disease just based off having a strep throat. So there are those possibilities out there. Like you said, we don't have the long-term data on that, so the jury's kind of still out on long-term effects because we have no long-term.
Right.
I wouldn't say it's any higher risk than any other vaccine that we've had, just based on the limited knowledge we have so far.
Okay, so we're getting toward wrapping this up here, but I have to touch on something because unfortunately, this will come up. I get emails about this pretty regularly, and it it goes back to a few different things. Obviously, within the body of Christ, over the past decade or two, there's been a lot of discussion concerning the Nephilim. These were these fallen principalities, or these principalities that actually chose to come down. In Genesis 6, it says the sons of God went into the daughters of men. So you have essentially these hybrid beings, right? So there's been a lot of conversation about this. Well, several years ago, there was a video that was put on YouTube, and it's come to be known as the FunVax video, the fundamentalist vaccine. And it seems to show someone lecturing a room full of, I think it claims to be CIA agents or something like this. And he's talking about a vaccine, or actually, I think it's a virus that they were talking about releasing into the Middle East that would destroy or it would infect the part of the brain that's responsible for religious fundamentalism. And it would actually sort of, neutralize that part of their brain and this type of thing. A lot of people have seen that, and what's funny is people say it's actually Bill Gates. Now, it's obviously not Bill Gates. If you watch the video and look at it, it's not Bill Gates, it's someone else. And the video has also since been widely debunked. It's essentially a Photoshop job. There's the presenter, for example, has an image up on the screen of a brain. It's a kind of an MRI of a brain, and as he's giving the lecture. Well, that particular image of the brain actually comes from you can cut images and search images and find where it was originally first put up on the internet. And I think about 5 years prior to the video being made, it's a scan of a meth addict, a woman, and that's her brain, but it's placed up there as though it's someone that has been infected in this sort of experimental type of thing. But anyway, people see these things, they believe it's real, they don't know that it's been debunked, they don't know that it's a scam, quite frankly. They actually traced the website that originally posted the video, and it was a guy who was going to make a fake documentary about this whole thing. It was kind of just like I don't know what you want to call it. It was just a scam. People have done the work, and they've proven that it's not even real. But you still have people that believe it, that Bill Gates has this plan to create this vaccine that will essentially destroy or somehow, again, neutralize the part of our brain that worships God and this type of thing. This is your field of specialty. Is that even possible? When we start talking, RNA vaccines, this is something new. It's different than the old form of classic traditional vaccines. Obviously, I think most scientists or doctors would hear this and kind of laugh, but there's a lot of people who do take this really seriously. So just talk about this. Is this even scientifically possible with these vaccines to somehow make it impossible? And this all ties in, by the way, John, with all of this discussion that I referenced, where people are just convinced that any vaccine, it hasn't even come out yet, before they even saw it, they were convinced that it's going to be the mark of the beast, that it will essentially cause us to be unable to worship God, and thus we'll be reprobate and damned to hell and this type of thing. So I know this is pretty far out there, but I just wanted you to touch on this.
I haven't heard that one before. But I mean, vaccines aren't designed to target anything in your body, basically. So your immune system can't make a response to anything in your body, or if it does, those cells are selected against. It's how immune cells mature. And if they make a response against something that would be what we call self, then those cells are removed from the population, basically. So as far as making an immune response against self, that isn't generally possible. And if it is, it causes like autoimmune diseases, as you've heard before. And those people, certain types of arthritis, and there's a lot of these. And generally those people are sick from these things. You can't just target something in your body and then expect to have no obvious negative consequences. So in general, no, I don't think that's possible. based on how vaccines work. And even if it was possible, there would be huge side effects, and I don't think your body could do that in general.
The other thing I think that's worth mentioning, and this is one of the issues when it comes to conspiracy theories, and look, guys, I want to be clear, there are conspiracies. There are people who conspire, and not every conspiracy is ridiculous, but when it comes to some of the more out there conspiracy theories, they all require people to be conspiring. And so whether we're talking, the flat earth, which requires not just tens of thousands, but hundreds of thousands of people all to be hiding the same truth, including tens of thousands of Christians, men and women, people of integrity. Likewise, with something like this, in order to believe something like this to be true, you have to believe that men like John, who are Christians, who work in the medical industry, scientists that are Christians, would be aware of this. They would be turning their blind eye. They would be letting it happen. They wouldn't be saying anything, and they wouldn't be intervening. So it's not just a theory, that people go, well, I don't trust them, the powers that be, the pharmaceuticals, the government, whatever. But the government, they're filled with all kinds of corrupt people, but there's also Christians that work in government, in the pharmaceutical industry, in various corporations, you name it. And in order to believe any one of these theories, you are, by definition, accusing people such as John of being complicit. Not just a few, not just a handful, but really a lot of Christians, a lot of good people and people of integrity. So that's something that it's just sort of part of the equation that I think a lot of people don't take into consideration. So I'm gonna end here, John. I'm gonna ask you this final question, and I think I know the answer, but when these vaccines are released, either Pfizer or Moderna, would you and your children, would you let your kids get them? Would you have any concerns, or would you prefer to wait a few months, or what's your sort of take in terms of how you feel about them and letting your family, or even let's say your elderly relatives, get them?
It's a great question. So for those that are an at-risk population, I would probably highly recommend they get the vaccine as soon as they can. Because as we talked about, as you mentioned before, this virus has probably been exaggerated in some aspects. It is still real. And if you are at risk in an at-risk population, you need to do everything you can to prevent yourself from having symptoms of this virus and getting sick from this virus. That being said, and how the vaccine is going to be rolled out, most of us won't have that option of, taking it right away, and there's going to be that lag and that delay. So in that case, there will be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who got it before the general population. In that situation, I would be very comfortable taking it. I would give it to my family, knowing how it works, knowing how it's manufactured. I believe it's generally safe, and especially for those at risk, I would highly recommend that they take the vaccine.
Well, listen, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to talk with me, John. I really appreciate it. I appreciate your expertise and kind of just answering all of these. Some of the questions are good. Some of them are probably a bit out there for scientists, but they're valid. These are conversations that are being had. So thank you so much for joining us. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Joel. It's been a pleasure.
You bet. So, okay, let me just end there, friends. That's all the time that we do have for now. Whether we're talking biblical exposition or the discussion of issues like this, we're all called to be Bereans. We're all called to, pray about these things ourselves and sort of do our homework. My guess is, because this was not a program filled with fear and conspiracies and negativity, that it probably will be met with a lot of negative responses. if I had done a video which said there's a solid chance if you get any one of these vaccines that you will have children that will be half werewolves, then that would have been, everybody would love it, and they would appreciate it. But unfortunately, sometimes just the truth is not very popular, and understandably so. There's a lot of insecurity. There's a lot of confusion just in this age that we're in right now. But I hope that it was helpful. I hope that it was helpful and edifying to you all. And again, just pray about these things. Go proceed with caution, but proceed with wisdom. And I hope that after listening, this will empower you all to walk in better discernment and in wisdom. So thanks again, guys. That's all the time that we have. Until next week, Maranatha.